thanks again a lot for this introduction. So my name is Philipp Veh and I'm working as a consultant with a special focus on hydrogen and carbon markets, and I'm especially focused on the combination of the two of them. I'm really happy to see so many people here, and I'm more than honored to have the opportunity today to elaborate on the topic CO2 certificates as additional revenue streams for green hydrogen projects. So the guiding question of this talk will be, how can carbon markets help to make low carbon hydrogen projects economically more viable? And first of all, I will very shortly cover the current challenges of green hydrogen, which Stefan already covered to a part at least, and also talk about potential solutions for that. After that, I'll give you an explanation of carbon markets. So basically what they are, how they work, and what different segments of carbon markets exist. And last but not least, I will elaborate on how carbon markets are or can be potentially used in order to ramp up a global hydrogen production and application. In the end, I hope there will be enough time to have a discussion on those findings. So before we dive into the topic, I will give you a very short introduction to the company I'm working at, the Perspectives Climate Group. So Perspectives is an independent consulting firm providing the private sector, governments, and non-governmental organizations with practical solutions for domestic and international climate policies, international carbon markets, and climate finance instruments. The company is internationally recognized for its outstanding contribution to the establishment and advancement of the clean development mechanism and other carbon market segments. And also, we have established ourselves over recent years in the hydrogen sector by consulting private companies and developing studies for various public entities. So the overall purpose of Perspectives is to shape a sustainable future by enabling public and private sector investments through carbon market activities and solutions. And with that, we already come to today's challenges of green hydrogen and its potential solutions. So low carbon hydrogen has the potential to decarbonize hard to abate sectors of our economy and can bring about vast economic chances for the private sector as well as for nations and regions. This is meanwhile globally recognized and has led to a hydrogen boom on both the political as well as the industry level. In just the past 5 years, more than 30 countries have developed or started to prepare national hydrogen strategies. And at the same time, green hydrogen projects worth more than $240 billion have been announced. Nonetheless, until today, only 10% of those projects have reached the final investment decisions. There are various reasons for that, and main reasons are, for example, missing long-term offtake agreements, so a demand pool, and the missing infrastructure for hydrogen transport, and the basic problem that green hydrogen is still significantly more costly in most regions than gray or blue hydrogen. The hypothesis of this talk is that carbon pricing and carbon markets can help to make green hydrogen projects more economically viable and can kickstart a massive ramp up. So on this slide, you can see the current and expected prices for 2030 and 2050 of different hydrogen production routes, based on the findings of the Global Hydrogen Review by the International Energy Agency from 2021. It can easily be seen that fossil fuel-based hydrogen ranges approximately between $1 and $3 per kilogram of hydrogen, while green hydrogen ranges between $4 and $9. Only in 2030, green hydrogen produced in very renewable energy-rich regions might reach cost parity with fossil fuel-based hydrogen. The table below shows the approximate greenhouse gas emissions of different energy carriers. It can be seen that green hydrogen produced with 100 renewable energies is considered to have zero embodied emissions, while fossil fuel-based hydrogen ranges from a minimum of about 2.8 kilograms CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen for blue hydrogen with a carbon capture rate of 90% to up to 14.5 kilograms for gray hydrogen, which is higher than the emissions from burning gas or coal. This is mainly due to the extensive upstream emissions, which can vary a lot depending on the region where, for example, the natural gas comes from. And those facts give the perfect basis for using carbon markets in order to close the cost gap between the different hydrogen technologies. Besides technological development and economies of scale, there are various ways to make green hydrogen economically more attractive. One can see the different approaches here, but I won't cover all of them today in detail. because it would just definitely extend the scope of this presentation. So governments can, for example, spur the further, they can introduce carbon pricing schemes, like, for example, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which will come into force in 2023 and will cover hydrogen and its derivatives. Within the CBAM, the embodied emissions of hydrogen are monitored and is then priced according to the European Emission Trading Scheme. Tax incentives and subsidies, like, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act from the USA, are another possibility to support the ramp up of low carbon hydrogen technologies. Finally, carbon markets can help to support low carbon hydrogen by creating additional revenue streams via the sales of carbon certificates. These carbon markets will now be covered in more detail. So what are basically carbon markets? So carbon markets are basically trading systems in which carbon credits are sold and bought. One tradable carbon credit equals 1 ton of carbon dioxide, or the equivalent amount of a different greenhouse gas. So generally, there are two different types of carbon markets. There's the compliance market, which includes, for example, the Clean Development Mechanism and the Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement, or the European Emission Trading Scheme. And then there's the voluntary carbon market, which is led by independent standard setters, like, for example, Verra or Gold Standard. There are a lot more organizations in the voluntary carbon market, but Verra and Gold Standard cover approximately 85% of the market share. And the main difference between the two market segments is that compliant markets are created and regulated by mandatory national, regional, or international carbon reduction regimes. Voluntary markets function outside of compliant markets and enable companies and individuals to purchase offsets on a voluntary basis with no intended use for compliance purposes. In the carbon markets, there are basically 4 players. So there's the project developer who designs and implements the offset project. There are the standard bodies which certify, set, and issue criteria for carbon credits. In this case, this would, for example, be Verra or Gold Standard. And then there are the end buyers, which in the case of the voluntary carbon market are corporations or individuals which are looking to offset their emissions through carbon credits. And in the compliance market, end buyers can also be governments, for example, in order to reach their national NDCs. The voluntary carbon market has grown continuously over the recent years. So since 2018, for example, the voluntary carbon market has expanded by more than 200%. And in 2022, its value exceeded $1 billion. Due to the increasing net zero pledges and new commitments from the private sector, the market is bound to rise even further and is expected to reach more than 500 million retired carbon credits by 2026. I think this shows very well the high importance of voluntary carbon markets as an instrument for carbon finance and as an instrument to spur hydrogen. So, but how do those carbon markets actually work? So carbon markets generally work based on a so-called baseline and project approach. So every project needs to determine first what its emissions would have been if the project was not implemented. That would be the so-called baseline emissions, which can be seen in this graph on the right side by the blue line and represents the emissions of using, in this example, diesel for transport. The number of credits a project receives is then calculated by subtracting the project emissions from the baseline emissions, which can be seen in this graph by the yellow line. And they represent the emissions if the fleet is changed to green hydrogen fuel. In order to calculate the specific baseline and project emissions, accredited methodologies have to be applied. To give you an example, so normally CAPEX and OPEX of hydrogen are higher than the CAPEX and OPEX of diesel in transportation. But if the project additionally generates carbon credits, those credits can be sold in order to generate additional revenue streams, which might help to make the project economically more attractive. And carbon methodologies basically outline detailed procedures for quantifying the actual greenhouse gas benefits of a project. They define, for example, eligibility criteria, the baseline emissions, and the approach in order to calculate the project emissions. They ensure that similar projects entail the same greenhouse gas benefits by applying the same approach and hence ensure the environmental integrity of the issued carbon credits. Regulators of carbon markets first need to approve methodologies so that resulting carbon credits are accepted in the system. It follows that the availability of hydrogen-specific methodologies is essential for harnessing carbon markets for hydrogen projects. And the problem is that to date, there are only very few and let's say very narrow hydrogen methodologies in the different carbon market segments. With the methodologies roughly explained, I would say, it's actually way more complex than what I just told you, but I just want to give you a short overview. With that, we come to the carbon credit cycle, which shows the different steps from the project description documents to the credit issuance. By applying the methodology on the project description document is designed and includes all necessary information on the intended project. This project is then validated by a third party. Then the project activity can be registered by the selected standard. After the project implementation, the emission reductions have to be monitored and reported. This normally happens on a yearly basis and are then verified by a third party. If no problems arise during this process, the emission reductions can be issued as carbon certificates. This complete process, excluding the methodology development, takes approximately 1 to 2 years. And with that, I want to give you a short historical overview of the development of the different carbon market segments. So this graph looks quite complicated, but I try to guide you through. So on the upper part, you can see the compliance market development, and on the lower part, the voluntary carbon market development since the 1990s. The first important agreement is the UNFCCC agreement from 1992, after which the first market pilot, the so-called activities jointly implemented, started. With the Kyoto Protocol passed in 1997, the first real carbon markets were developed. Those were the joint implementation and the clean development mechanism. In 2001, the Marrakesh Accords were reached, which among other things defined the details for establishing, implementing and monitoring the protocol's clean development mechanism. This was the main start of carbon markets in general. In 2015, the historical Paris Agreement was reached. Part of the Paris Agreement were new rules for the international compliance carbon market, which are superseding the CDM and the joint implementation with the Paris Agreement Article 6.4 and Article 6.2. What is important to note here is the main difference with this new set of rules. On the one hand, so that all UN countries have now defined the national determined contributions, or NDCs, which defines the national carbon reduction goals of the respective states, which can be reached by emission trading. On the other hand, the project host countries now need to approve the export of carbon credits, which gives a lot more power to the host countries, which are traditionally located in developing or emerging countries. This approval is called corresponding adjustment and is a strong instrument against double counting of credits, because corresponding adjustment credits which are exported cannot be considered regarding the host country's NDC goals. The Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement is expected to be operational in 2003, so sometimes end of the year probably. On this slide, you can see parts of the different carbon market segments ordered into UNFCCC, national legislations, and voluntary carbon markets. The most important carbon market segments for hydrogens are in the compliance sector are currently Article 6.2 and Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement. Since the CDM is currently phased out, it is not highly relevant anymore for upcoming hydrogen projects. Under the national legislation, the EU ETS, or rather the CBAM, might be of high importance for hydrogen projects, especially for projects aiming to export PTX products to Europe. The CBAM rules can have a significant impact on the landed costs of the PTX products. The joint crediting mechanism of Japan is currently becoming a frontrunner regarding hydrogen projects and has just recently issued a call for proposals related to the so-called pilot project for comprehensive support throughout the whole hydrogen supply chain abroad. Japan has already selected the respective countries for hydrogen production and utilization and will thus soon be implementing the first hydrogen project based on carbon markets. Furthermore, as noted before, the voluntary carbon market will most probably be path leading for novel low carbon hydrogen methodologies. And finally, I wanted to give you a short overview of current and expected prices for different carbon credits. Here it's important to keep in mind that those prices are average prices and do not necessarily reflect prices for specific credits generated from green hydrogen projects. It is expected that due to the high political and public attention of green hydrogen projects, the generated credits might be traded at higher prices than the average prices which are shown here. So average prices today range between 2 to 6 euros per ton of CO2 to 6 to 12 euros per ton of CO2 for voluntary carbon market credits with or without corresponding adjustments. Most probably, voluntary carbon markets without corresponding adjustments will decrease in value in the coming years, while carbon credits with corresponding adjustments will most probably reach prices of 12 to 24 euros per ton of CO2. Internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, or so-called ITMOs, from Article 6 of the Paris Agreement are expected to rise to 24 to 34 euros per ton of CO2 and are bound to rise even further. To put this in comparison, the prices for the so-called EU allowances under the European Emission Trading Scheme is shown on this slide. So today, the EU allowances are traded at approximately 90 euros per ton of CO2. And due to the increasing climate ambitions in the EU, these allowance prices will rise even further in coming years. These prices will also be reflected in the upcoming carbon border adjustment mechanism, since the prices for so-called CBAM certificates will be the weekly average of EUA prices. So I hope this gave you all a sufficient overview and understanding of carbon markets in general. And so now we can move to the more specific cases of using carbon markets for hydrogen projects. So what is the current state of hydrogen in carbon markets? Until now, there are only 3 carbon methodologies relating to hydrogen submitted to the respective standard setters. One is referring to the emission reduction caused by hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, the other one to the emission reduction through hydrogen production from renewable resources. Both of those methodologies were submitted to the CDM Executive Board rather recently. The third one is a concept which was submitted to Verra, focusing on a special mobile hydrogen production technology named Hydrogen. All of those methodologies are very narrow and can only be applied to projects with very specific characteristics. So, for example, the second methodology is only applicable if a coal-based hydrogen production facility is replaced by a 100% renewable powered hydrogen production facility, and basically only describes a fuel switch from coal to renewable energies. Furthermore, until today, no carbon credits have been generated from hydrogen projects. This is on the one side due to the nascent stage of the hydrogen market, but more importantly due to the high complexity of hydrogen value chains. This is why Perspectives, in collaboration with South Pole and with the support of the 2 biggest standard setters, Gold Standard and Verra, is currently launching the Hydrogen for Net Zero initiative in order to develop a comprehensive set of methodologies covering all possible supply chains for hydrogen production and its utilization. So the rationale for launching the initiative was that the high complexity of hydrogen markets make it almost impossible to develop specific methodologies for single customers which could cover different hydrogen production, processing, transport, and application technologies. In order to reach that, a multi-stakeholder platform with participants from all parts of the hydrogen supply chain is needed. The overarching goal of the initiative is to unlock the potential of renewable and low-carbon hydrogen by bringing together stakeholders such as industry leaders, investors, NGOs, and policymakers to enable them to utilize carbon markets for making the hydrogen investments economically feasible. So how can this goal actually be reached? So the initiative is composed out of 2 main pillars. The first one is focused on unlocking carbon finance for hydrogen activities. Within this pillar, in the first step, the initiative will develop a comprehensive methodology framework for the two biggest voluntary standard setters, Verra and Gold Standard. Since the initiative is in constant contact with both standards, it will be able to generate harmonized methodologies, which most probably can be applied for both carbon market segments. This would be the first time that similar methodologies can be applied within the two standards. In the second step, the initiative will develop a similar methodological framework for the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. The second pillar of the initiative is a stakeholder engagement and information platform, and there are members. The members will be informed regarding new hydrogen policies, standards, and support schemes. Further, it will facilitate the internal exchange of the members by roundtables and working groups. So, what does this actually mean to develop a methodological framework for carbon markets? So first of all, the complete hydrogen supply chain has to be investigated. And this is not an extensive list, but rather just an example to kind of show the complexity of such a methodological framework. And so those different steps have to be ordered with a staggering approach in production, processing, transport, and storage technologies, including the possible applications of hydrogen, since the actual emission reduction normally only takes place at the point of application. So for each of the steps, we will develop high quality modules or tools which describe how to calculate the related emissions and which feed into the overarching methodological framework. So members can bring in their specific projects or project ideas, and according to their supply chain and hydrogen applications, the first modules and tools will be developed. For example, you might produce hydrogen with a PEM electrolyzer in India, produce ammonia out of it and ship it to another country where it will be stored in tanks and then applied in the fertilizer production to substitute gray hydrogen, and by this significantly reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. By this approach, we foresee that step by step we'll be able to tick each and every of the boxes and produce a comprehensive methodological framework for the hydrogen ecosystem. By working together with Gold Standard and Verra, this assures a high degree of standardization, which will enable our partners to easily select in which market segment they want to certify their greenhouse gas reductions. And to simplify this explanation a little bit, you can see here how this MES framework will be finally applied and how carbon credits will be generated. So we designed this exemplary use case regarding the substitution of gray hydrogen by green hydrogen for the application in industry. So here you can see the two supply chains of gray and green hydrogen and its associated emissions. By applying the methodological framework, we will have detailed instructions on how to calculate those emissions. So in the green hydrogen production, you could have very minor emissions if you only use dedicated renewable energies for powering the electrolyzer and also the processing plant. So in this example, the only greenhouse gas emissions come from the transport by ship. In the gray hydrogen supply chain, one has significantly higher emissions, mainly generated by upstream emissions from natural gas and extraction, and the processing from the steam methane reformation process. So overall, the green hydrogen supply chain involves emissions of about 2 kilograms CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen, and the gray one more than 15 kilograms. So if we now assume the following exemplary project data with an electrolyzer capacity of 100 megawatts and full load hours of approximately 90%, a total of approximately 17,000 tons of hydrogen can be produced. If we use this hydrogen to replace the gray hydrogen, the project could reduce emissions by approximately 220,000 tons of CO2 equivalents. This amount is equal to the generated carbon credits. So if we now assume certificate prices between $10 and $30, the sales of carbon credits could generate additional revenue streams of approximately 2.2 to 6.6 million US dollars. This can be translated to additional revenue streams per kilogram of hydrogen of approximately 10 to 30 US cents, which is significant, I would say. And with that, we already come to the key takeaways of these presentations. So green hydrogen is still significantly more expensive than other production forms, but it also involves significantly less embodied greenhouse gas emissions. Carbon markets can monetize this fact in in order to make green hydrogen investments more economically attractive. Per kilogram of hydrogen, carbon markets can generate up to additional revenue streams of up to 30 cents with expected certificate prices. Further, there are various carbon market segments which can be used for hydrogen projects, but until today, there are no comprehensive carbon methodologies for green hydrogen projects. From my personal experience, I'm convinced that concerted action is needed to develop a comprehensive methodological framework and thus unlock carbon markets for green hydrogen projects. So that was it from my side. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.